What happens when the youngest White House press secretary is humiliated mid-flight and responds not with rage, but with calculated calm that topples an entire airline's reputation? This isn't just a tale of political bias. It's about grace under pressure, silent power, and the ripple effect of dignity. The polished marble floors of Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 1 reflected the late afternoon sun as Karoline Leavitt stepped through the security checkpoint with her usual quiet precision. Clad in a tailored navy blazer over a white blouse, her hair styled in soft, professional curls, she moved with the practiced grace of someone used to being watched, but rarely recognized without cameras nearby. As the youngest White House press secretary in American history, Karoline was no stranger to high-stakes environments, but today's flight wasn't about headlines or press conferences. It was, in her mind, a rare moment to breathe. The West Coast awaited her with back-to-back strategic meetings, but for now the plane would be her temporary sanctuary. She held her phone in one hand, scanning a few last-minute updates from her staff, while in the other she clutched a slim, leather briefcase, containing briefing folders, a slim notebook, and one carefully annotated copy of a pending speech on national civic discourse. Around her, the usual swirl of passengers bustled through gates, business travelers in sleek luggage trails, parents corralling toddlers, the occasional influencer setting up a selfie. But Karoline remained focused, checking her gate and approaching boarding with the confidence of someone who had long stopped doubting where she belonged. The gate agent smiled, scanning her first-class boarding pass. "Welcome aboard, Miss Leavitt," she said, with the faint spark of recognition in her eyes. Karoline nodded politely, used to the occasional flicker of awareness, just enough to remind her that anonymity was never absolute. As she walked down the jet bridge toward Atlas Pacific Airways Flight 78, bound for San Diego, she allowed herself one rare indulgence: quiet. The cabin doors welcomed her with the soft whoosh of circulated air and calming instrumental music overhead. A flight attendant at the front offered a warm greeting, but Karoline didn't catch the name tag. She was focused on finding her seat, 2A, a window seat in first class. She reached it quickly, stowed her briefcase in the overhead bin, and settled in with practiced ease. A notepad emerged from her bag, followed by a slim gold pen. She flipped to a blank page and began writing, her long strokes deliberate and unhurried. Notes for the upcoming summit? Perhaps. Or maybe a private entry. No one ever really knew what Karoline was scripting in those neat lines. Her expression, as always, was calm, unreadable, self-contained. Passengers filtered in slowly, most barely noticing her. A young man glanced her way, puzzled as if her face rang a bell, but moved on without comment. From across the aisle, a woman in a designer coat cast a quick glance. Was it admiration or judgment? Karoline never assumed. She simply rode. Somewhere in the back of the plane, a murmur of activity signaled the boarding of coach passengers, but in the serenity of the forward cabin, time seemed to pause. The air smelled of citrus and linen. Karoline took a breath, steady and deep. She had weathered press ambushes, political firestorms, and viral storms of misinformation, but here, for a few hours, she could be still. Little did she know, turbulence would come not from the sky above, but from the aisle beside her. She glanced at her watch. The plane would be pushing back soon. Just another flight, just another day, or so it seemed. As the final passengers filed into the cabin, a subtle shift rippled through the air. Not enough for most to notice, but Karoline felt it. The rustle of coats being folded, the clink of seatbelt buckles, the quiet shuffle of attendants preparing for takeoff. Everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. From the front galley, a figure approached with quick, purposeful steps. Alyssa Crane, the first-class lead attendant, moved with the crisp efficiency of someone who took pride in her control of the cabin. Her uniform was immaculate, her hair pulled back tight into a no-nonsense bun, her eyes sharp and constantly assessing. Alyssa wasn't just a flight attendant. She was the unofficial enforcer of first-class order. And as her gaze swept the row of passengers, it stalled when it landed on Karoline Leavitt. A subtle pause. A narrowing of the eyes. Not because Karoline was disruptive. On the contrary, she sat quietly in her seat, pen in hand, jotting notes into her leather-bound notebook. but Elisa recognized her. She'd seen that face during press briefings, had once quoted a sharp-tongued response of hers on social media with a flurry of angry emojis. Karoline Leavitt, the voice of an administration Elisa resented deeply. With a forced smile, Elisa stepped closer. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said in a tone that was all surface-level professionalism, but edged with cool formality. "May I see your boarding pass?" Karoline looked up, momentarily surprised but unbothered. She offered the pass without hesitation. "Of course." Elisa took it, scanned it, then held it just a little too long, like she was searching for something to be wrong. "This is a first-class ticket, correct?" she asked, feigning confusion. Karoline nodded, the corners of her mouth lifting ever so slightly in acknowledgement of the absurdity. "Yes, seat 2A." Elisa returned the pass with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, but her voice had a cold undertone, as if Karoline's very presence in that section unsettled the natural order of things. Karoline didn't react. She tucked the boarding pass away and resumed her notes as if the moment had passed. But it hadn't. Not for Elisa. As she turned and made her way back toward the galley, her expression darkened. She leaned into a quiet huddle with another crew member, gesturing subtly toward seat 2A. From her clipped tone and tense posture, it was clear the discussion wasn't about safety or logistics. It was personal. Political. The seed of something inappropriate yet dangerous had been planted. Meanwhile, Karoline remained composed, unaware of the low whisper trailing in her wake. Or perhaps she was aware and simply chose not to give it power. Either way, the first crack in the flight's routine had appeared, and from there, things would unravel faster than anyone on board could imagine. It began with a return of footsteps, of authority, of pretense. Elisa Crane re-emerged from the galley not 10 minutes after her initial encounter with Karoline, but this time her posture had changed. There was a stiffness in her spine and a sharp edge to her smile. She moved through the first-class cabin like someone preparing for confrontation, dressed in courtesy. Passengers barely noticed as she stopped beside seat 2A. "Miss Leavitt," she said, her voice slightly louder than necessary, drawing the attention of those seated nearby. Karoline looked up from her notebook, pen still poised in hand. "Yes?" Elisa gestured toward the galley. "Would you mind stepping with me for a moment? There's something I need to check regarding your ticket." The request was framed as polite, but the tone held something else. Something dismissive. Karoline raised a brow, surprised but not unsettled. She nodded once, slid her pen into her notebook, and stood, smoothing the lapels of her blazer with quiet poise. As she followed Elisa past the curious gazes of fellow passengers, whispers began to stir. Who was she? Why was she being pulled aside? The contrast between Karoline's calm and the attendant's clipped pace created a subtle tension that didn't go unnoticed. In the galley, away from immediate ears but not out of sight, Elisa crossed her arms. "There's been a mix-up," she said curtly. "Your seat appears to have been double-booked." Karoline blinked once. "That's strange. I booked this flight 2 weeks ago and received confirmation yesterday." Elisa didn't flinch. "Be that as it may, we're asking that you move to economy for the remainder of the flight." The phrasing, "we're asking," barely disguised the coercion. Karoline's brows knit, and for the first time her voice cooled. "Is that standard policy for first-class passengers with confirmed seats?" Elisa didn't answer directly. "This seat isn't appropriate," she said flatly, the words dropping like lead. There it was, not a technicality but a judgment, and Karoline understood immediately. This wasn't about logistics, it was about optics, about ideology, about discomfort with who she was and what she represented. But instead of protesting, she drew a slow breath and exhaled with grace. "Very well," she said simply. "Please direct me to my new seat." Elisa's expression flickered, perhaps expecting a fight, not surrender. She nodded and led the way. As the two women walked back through the cabin, eyes turned. The whispers grew louder. Some passengers leaned into the aisle, others exchanged looks of disapproval or curiosity. Karoline, however, kept her chin level, her posture steady. Not once did she flinch. Only her hand, wrapped tightly around the handle of her briefcase, betrayed the slightest tension. Elisa pointed toward a cramped middle seat halfway down the economy cabin. "Here," she said, almost triumphantly. Karoline placed her briefcase beneath the seat in front of her, lowered herself into the tight space with practiced ease, and offered no more than a polite nod in response. "Thank you," she said evenly. Alyssa turned on her heel and walked away, unaware of the ripple she'd just triggered. Moments later, Lena Patel, a junior attendant with a gentle demeanor, appeared with a small cup of water. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" she asked softly. Karoline glanced up and gave her a small, appreciative smile. "Just a minor mix-up? Thank you, Ms. Patel." Lena hesitated, clearly sensing that something more was beneath the surface, but nodded and stepped away. Karoline retrieved her phone from her bag and began typing a message. Not frantic, not emotional, but precise. "Something has happened. Don't escalate until I give the word. Stand by." She hit send, then leaned back into her seat. Around her, the cabin buzzed with idle chatter, the occasional announcement, the hum of an engine preparing for takeoff. But inside Karoline's mind, a different kind of flight was already underway. She hadn't lost her seat. She'd been underestimated, and that mistake was about to cost someone everything. Karoline sat in silence, her posture dignified even within the narrow confines of an economy seat that seemed almost deliberately chosen for discomfort. The cabin had begun to settle into its pre-takeoff rhythm, but an invisible current still pulsed through the air. Passengers who had witnessed her removal from first class whispered behind cupped hands, casting furtive glances in her direction. A few turned back in their seats, clearly curious, but Karoline gave them nothing. Not indignation, not visible frustration, not even the satisfaction of a sigh. She was unreadable, like a seasoned diplomat awaiting her turn at the podium. The only clue to her thoughts came in the form of her hands, steady, deliberate, as they moved across her phone. Her fingers tapped out a short message to her communications aide. "Event occurred on flight. Wait for my go. Let's monitor ops first." She read it once, added a single word, discreetly, and hit send. From behind the curtain, Alyssa Crane moved with the artificial cheerfulness of someone trying to maintain control after a risky decision. She passed out champagne flutes to first-class passengers, her posture stiff with manufactured ease. But she couldn't help glancing toward the back of the cabin. Karoline's composure unnerved her more than any outburst could have. She'd expected resistance, maybe even a scene, but what she got instead was unnerving calm. The kind of calm that suggested deeper waters. The kind that said, "You may have acted first, but you won't act last." Meanwhile, Marcus Wynne, the veteran flight supervisor who had overheard Elisa's earlier conversation in the galley, wasn't so easily reassured. He pulled Elisa aside discreetly during a break in service. "That woman you moved. Do you know who she is?" he asked quietly. Elisa waved him off. "Just another entitled conservative. She didn't fit the profile for first class." Marcus frowned. "That's Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, and you just made a very public call that's going to look very political." Alyssa's face lost a shade of color. "I didn't realize it was her," she muttered. "It doesn't matter now," Marcus said flatly. "What matters is whether she decides to respond, and how." Back in economy, Karoline gently closed her phone and took out her notebook again, this time only flipping through a few pages before resting the cover on her lap. She was no longer writing, she was watching, observing, calculating. She had no intention of lashing out in public or confronting Lisa in the aisle. That wasn't how change happened. That wasn't how power moved. Her mind was already turning to optics, narrative, and pressure points. If this became public, it wouldn't just be about one employee, it would become a referendum on bias, professionalism, and the corporate culture that tolerated both. Lena Patel returned once more, quietly placing a fresh napkin beside the water cup on Karoline's tray. "If there's anything else I can do, please, don't hesitate," she said gently. Karoline looked up and nodded. "You've been very kind, thank you, Ms. Patel." Her voice was soft but firm, carrying more authority in that single sentence than most did in entire speeches. Lena blushed faintly and retreated, still unaware of the story quietly unfolding in row 17. Outside, the plane began taxiing to the runway. Inside, one woman waited, unshaken, unhurried, and utterly in control of what would come next. 7 minutes after the flight leveled out at cruising altitude, a ripple began, not among the passengers, but 30,000 feet below. Karoline Leavitt's earlier message had reached its intended recipient. Her digital signal, just a brief sentence typed from row 17C, had made its way to Edgar Walsh, senior advisor to President Trump and the gatekeeper of her strategic network. When he read the words, "Proceed, eyes on ops, no contact yet," he understood what it meant. It was more than a heads-up. It was authorization to begin quiet escalation. Within minutes, Walsh placed a direct call to the Atlas Pacific executive line, his tone measured but unmistakably firm. "There's an issue on Flight 78, he said, involving a sitting federal officer, White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt. We advise immediate review and corrective action before landing." The call was brief, surgical. No threats, just implications. And in Washington, implication was everything. A few moments later, in the cockpit of Flight 708, Captain Ron Hatcher received a call over the encrypted satellite line. An unusual occurrence. Mid-flight. He adjusted his headset and listened, his expression shifting from neutral to alert. "Understood," he said, glancing at the flight manifest before leaning toward the intercom. Then he called for Alyssa Crane to report to the front of the plane. Lisa arrived a minute later, visibly uncertain. The captain's words were quiet but serious. "We've just received notice from Atlas Pacific HQ. Ms. Leavitt is on board, from the White House." Elisa's breath caught. I didn't," she began, but the captain raised a hand. "Doesn't matter. What matters is that she was downgraded without just cause, and that's already been flagged. From this point forward, you are not to interact with her unless absolutely necessary. Do you understand?" Alyssa nodded, her stomach turning. "Yes, sir." Back in economy, Karoline sat still, hands folded neatly over her notebook. Her eyes flicked up briefly as the intercom crackled with a flight update courtesy of the captain. His voice was smooth, even, but to those who paid attention, something had changed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for choosing Atlas Pacific. If you need any assistance during this flight, please reach out to your cabin crew. All passengers are to be treated with the highest standard of care and respect." It sounded routine, but Karoline knew better. It was the first audible shift in tone, one that confirmed her quiet counterattack had landed. She offered a slight nod to no one in particular, then calmly reopened her notebook and resumed writing. Elisa, meanwhile, returned to the galley with trembling hands. Marcus Wynne watched her closely. "They called, didn't they?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Elisa nodded slowly. "I'm not supposed to talk to her anymore." Marcus shook his head. "This is bigger than you thought, and it's not over." Elisa didn't respond. She couldn't. The altitude hadn't changed, but the balance of power had. And somewhere in economy, a calm woman with a pen had just rewritten the flight path without ever raising her voice. As the plane cruised westward over Nebraska, the atmosphere inside the cabin seemed to split along an invisible seam. For the average passenger, the flight remained uneventful. Drinks were served, movies flickered on overhead screens, and conversations buzzed in hushed tones. But for those attuned to subtle energies, something had shifted. The first-class cabin, once confidently ruled by Alyssa Crane's brisk efficiency, now felt uncertain, brittle. Her movements, once assertive, had grown rehearsed and robotic. She smiled too wide, spoke too quickly, avoided eye contact. The confidence she had when escorting Karoline Leavitt to the back of the plane had evaporated, replaced by a flickering anxiety she could neither hide nor explain away. Every time her eyes drifted down the aisle toward economy, they caught on Karoline's seat like a snag in fabric. Karoline hadn't moved, hadn't complained, hadn't even looked her way, but her presence was now inescapable. In contrast, Karoline was a portrait of composure. She sat quietly, legs crossed, occasionally glancing out the window or jotting a line in her notebook. Her expression betrayed nothing, but, to the trained observer, there was power in that silence. She wasn't waiting, she was watching. Orchestrating. Her phone vibrated once with a message she didn't bother hiding. "Media team aware, statement ready if needed." She tapped a brief reply, then locked the screen. There was no urgency in her actions, and that alone made them all the more unsettling. Across from her, the same businessman who had noticed her earlier leaned in and whispered, "You sure you're okay?" Karoline looked at him and offered the faintest smile. "Perfectly," she said simply. The man studied her a moment longer, then leaned back in his seat, now more curious than concerned. Meanwhile, Lena Patel had taken notice. She'd been observing the awkward tension between crew members and sensed that something deeper was at play. She made her way down the aisle again with a tray of beverages and paused beside Karoline. "Miss, can I get you anything?" she asked softly. Karoline looked up and met Lena's gaze with appreciation. "Just water, please," she replied. Lena returned a moment later, setting the cup down gently. "If you need anything, I'm here." Karoline's eyes lingered on Lena's name tag. "Thank you, Lena," she said, her voice as calm as ever. Lena smiled and walked away, her steps a little more deliberate than before. She didn't know the full story, but she knew enough to sense respect was due. Back in the galley, Marcus approached Elisa again. "You feeling it yet?" he asked quietly. Elisa didn't answer. Her fingers were clenched around a cup, her knuckles white. "You made a call based on politics," Marcus said bluntly, "but this woman? She doesn't scream, she doesn't tweet, she acts, and you just gave her motive." Elisa turned away, trying to collect herself, but she already knew he was right. From somewhere in the back of the plane, power had quietly reversed course, and for the first time, Elisa wasn't sure who was actually running this flight. As Flight 78 began its gradual descent into San Diego, the cabin stirred with the usual signs of arrival. Tray tables clicking shut, seat backs easing upright, the quiet rustle of bags being readied beneath seats. But beneath the surface of routine, a very different descent was taking place. One that had nothing to do with altitude. Elisa Crane stood near the front galley, her face pale and her nerves frayed to the edge. Every announcement from the captain sounded like a ticking clock. Every glance from a passenger felt like a judgment. She had been flying long enough to know turbulence when she saw it, and this was the kind that didn't show up on radar. Her earlier sense of moral victory had long since curdled into dread, and it deepened with each minute closer to the gate. In economy, Karoline Leavitt remained unchanged. Her posture was still impeccable, her expression calm, but her focus had narrowed. With the precision of someone preparing for a press briefing, she reviewed a final checklist on her phone. Her message from earlier had done its job. Atlas Pacific's executive team was now fully briefed, media inquiries were being quietly redirected to her office, and legal counsel was on standby. She wasn't seeking spectacle, she was ensuring structure. A statement of accountability had already been drafted, awaiting only her go. Around her, passengers noticed the respectful deference the crew now showed her, an invisible shift in the cabin hierarchy. One man muttered to his seatmate, "Who is she?" but no one dared ask directly. Back in the cockpit, Captain Ron Hatcher received a final communique from operations. "Miss Leavitt is to be given priority deplaning, escort if necessary, security will be waiting at the gate, do not involve cabin staff further." He acknowledged it with a tight nod, knowing the implications were far above his pay grade. Minutes later, as the plane's wheels touched down on the tarmac with a smooth thud, a quiet tension blanketed the front of the aircraft. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and Elisa instinctively turned toward the aisle, only to freeze. Two uniformed airport security officers stepped onto the aircraft just as the jet bridge connected. One of them asked quietly, "Is Elisa Crane present?" The words sent a visible ripple through the front galley. Elisa stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's me," the lead officer nodded. "We need to speak with you regarding a reported incident on this flight. Please come with us." Her face drained of all color. Behind her, Marcus Wynn stood stone-faced, saying nothing, but offering the faintest nod to the unfolding justice. As passengers began filing out, Karoline remained seated, deliberately unhurried. When the aisle had mostly cleared, she stood, gathered her briefcase, and made her way forward. Her eyes met Elisa's for a fleeting moment. No gloating, no malice, just certainty. Elisa looked away first, and just like that, the woman who had been removed from her seat hours ago now walked off the plane in full control, while the one who had displaced her was being escorted into the unknown. The fluorescent lights inside the airport's operations annex buzzed faintly overhead as Alyssa Crane sat in a sterile room flanked by 2 security officers and a silent wall of corporate consequence. Her Navy uniform, once crisp and commanding, now felt like a weight, a symbol of the authority she had overstepped. The room was cold, quiet, and unmistakably controlled. Across the table sat a representative from Atlas Pacific's Internal Affairs Division and a legal observer. A manila folder labeled Flight 788, Incident Report, sat unopened in front of them. Elisa's heart pounded as the first question landed, blunt and unmistakable. "Can you explain the rationale behind your decision to move Ms. Karoline Leavitt from first class to economy?" Elisa hesitated, already knowing there was no answer that could undo what she had set in motion. I didn't recognize her at first," she said weakly. "She didn't seem like the usual first-class passenger." That final phrase hung in the air like a noose. The Internal Affairs agent didn't even blink. "So you made a decision based on assumption, not procedure." Alyssa opened her mouth but nothing came out. The silence answered for her. Outside that room, the fallout was already underway. Atlas Pacific executives had been blindsided by the velocity of the story. Within 2 hours of landing, Karoline's name was trending on social media, and the airline's customer service inbox had become a flood zone of outrage, support, and media requests. Her official title, White House Press Secretary, was now emblazoned across major news banners, and phrases like political discrimination and corporate accountability were circling like hawks. Internally, the airline's PR team was scrambling to craft a response that wouldn't sound like spin, but the reality was unavoidable. They had to act fast and visibly, or risk hemorrhaging more than just public goodwill. Back in the investigation room, Alyssa tried again. "It wasn't personal," she said, her voice shaky. "I didn't think it was a big deal." The legal observer finally spoke. "Miss Crane, do you understand that Miss Leavitt is not just a passenger but a high-ranking federal official? Your actions have been interpreted as politically motivated and discriminatory." The word discriminatory made Alyssa's shoulders slump. "I didn't mean for it to be," she whispered. But intent, as the legal team knew, meant little when perception and protocol were violated. The verdict was clear, even if unofficially delivered. She had become a liability. As the session closed, Alyssa was informed she was suspended from duty pending formal review and would be escorted out of the facility immediately. Her badge was collected, her access revoked. The final blow came not with yelling or scandal, but with paperwork, silence, and shame. Outside, the sky over San Diego was turning amber, the city preparing for evening, and inside the belly of the airport, Alyssa Crane, who once thought she controlled the air, now realized she was grounded in every possible way. Back in Washington, the late evening sun cast long shadows across the South Lawn as Karoline Leavitt stepped into her office on the second floor of the West Wing. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor, echoing with quiet resolve. A fresh stack of briefing folders awaited her on the desk. Policy memos, upcoming press conference outlines, and now, printed screenshots of trending posts from social media. Fly with respect. Karoline was right, and Boycott Atlas Pacific had taken over the digital landscape. Her communications team had been working around the clock since the plane touched down. But Karoline herself? She hadn't rushed. She hadn't posted. She hadn't spoken a word to the press. She knew better. Control wasn't about speaking first, it was about speaking last, and speaking with weight. She slipped off her blazer, rolled up her sleeves, and sat down, flipping through a folder titled Flight 780 Public Response Timeline. Everything had unfolded exactly as she had expected. A knock on the door interrupted her concentration. Her aide Sarah stepped in with a laptop and a cautious smile. "We've got a call from Edgar Walsh. He says President Trump was briefed. They want you to know." "You handled it perfectly." Karoline nodded slightly, but her face remained focused. "Tell Edgar I'll speak with him in the morning. I want to finish reviewing the airline's internal memo first." Sarah hesitated. "Also, there's a press request from the Post. They're asking for a quote." Karoline glanced up, voice calm. "They'll wait." She opened a file marked Crew Statements and read the words of Lena Patel, the kind flight attendant who had treated her with quiet dignity. Karoline underlined Lena's name and jotted a note beside it. Follow-up commendation. Internal and public. Karoline's phone buzzed again. A message from Atlas Pacific's legal team had arrived, formally acknowledging the incident, offering an apology and requesting a private conversation to ensure a productive path forward. She read it once, then once more. This wasn't just an apology. It was an admission of consequence, and she intended to make sure it led to more than cosmetic change. She picked up her pen and began drafting her response. Professional, firm, and clear. I welcome Atlas Pacific's commitment to accountability, but systemic correction begins with cultural recalibration, not just apologies. She paused, then added, "This isn't personal. This is policy." When she finished, she sat back in her chair, letting the quiet hum of Washington night seep into the room. Outside the office window, the Capitol continued its endless spin. Press cycles, political maneuvering, optics, and scandals. But inside that room, a very different kind of power was being exercised. Not reactive, not vengeful, but precise, strategic, and enduring. Karoline Leavitt hadn't just regained her seat, she had reasserted the fundamental expectation that dignity, regardless of belief or position, was not up for reassignment. And as she looked once more at Lena Patel's name, a faint smile crossed her lips. One kind voice, one silent witness, had reminded her why she did this work in the first place. The morning after the incident, America woke up not to breaking news, but to a cultural reckoning already in motion. By 8:00 a.m., major news outlets were running lead stories about the flight that sparked a firestorm. Atlas Pacific Airways had issued an official apology just before sunrise, but it did little to stem the tide. Screens across the country flashed headlines like, "Press Secretary removed from first class, retaliation," while talk shows dissected every detail of the incident with fervor usually reserved for election scandals. Twitter, now rebranded as X, had become a digital courtroom, and Karoline's silence only made the speculation louder. Her restraint was interpreted as strength. Her calm became the story, and within 24 hours, respect in flight and accountability air were trending globally. It wasn't just about Karoline anymore, it was about every passenger who had ever felt dismissed, profiled, or displaced. Atlas Pacific's stock dropped 6.5% by noon. Shareholders demanded emergency meetings. Public relations teams scrambled to contain the damage, issuing statements about enhanced bias training, new vetting protocols, and employee accountability measures. But many critics weren't buying it. Conservative groups rallied behind Karoline, framing the incident as a blatant example of ideological discrimination. Meanwhile, civil liberties advocates reframed the narrative around broader issues of unconscious bias in customer service industries. On both sides of the political aisle, the conversation exploded, and at the center of it all was Karoline, who had yet to speak. She didn't need to. The facts were already speaking for her. In private, Karoline's team fielded dozens of interview requests and speaking invitations. Airlines across the country began quietly reviewing their training policies. A major competitor even reached out with an internal audit proposal, asking if she would consult. She declined politely. "This isn't about leverage," she told her aide, Sarah. "It's about precedent." That phrase became its own kind of headline, echoed in editorials praising her restraint and leadership. At the White House, the communications office released a brief statement. Ms. Leavitt was subjected to inappropriate treatment. She responded with professionalism, and we commend her for setting an example under pressure. It was simple, but powerful. Meanwhile, Lena Patel, the young economy class attendant who had treated Karoline with dignity, received a letter of commendation and an offer for promotion. Her quiet act of decency had not gone unnoticed. She became a secondary symbol of the story, a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing is enough to change someone's trajectory. In contrast, Alyssa Crane's name leaked online within hours of her suspension. While some rushed to defend her, citing political pressure and workplace stress, the overwhelming consensus was clear. She had made a choice. And in 2025, choices like that didn't happen in the shadows anymore. The incident aboard Flight 78 had become more than a travel dispute. It had become a mirror held up to America's service industries, its political divides, and its assumptions about power. And while the nation reacted with outrage, debate, and reflection, Karoline Leavitt quietly returned to her duties. Her seat no longer a symbol of status, but of the cost of underestimating silence. A week later, Karoline Leavitt boarded another flight, this time from Washington, D.C. to Phoenix. The headlines had cooled, the outrage had shifted to newer controversies, and Atlas Pacific was still working overtime to repair its brand. But the ripple effects from Flights 7 and 8 hadn't stopped. They had simply gone deeper. As Karoline stepped onto this new flight, her presence triggered no special announcements, no direct orders from above, and yet something was unmistakably different. The smiles from the crew were more genuine. The tone of voice, warmer. She noticed an attendant helping a young mother without being asked. Another took a moment to kneel beside an elderly passenger to explain a gate change. These small gestures weren't dramatic, but they were intentional. They were the result of awareness, of pressure, of precedent, the kind Karoline had quietly set in motion with a notebook, a phone, and an unwavering refusal to be diminished. As she settled into her aisle seat, not first class, not economy, just a quiet spot near the middle of the plane, Karoline observed the cabin with a different kind of focus. She wasn't here to monitor, she was here to notice, to see whether the culture she had challenged was truly beginning to shift. Near the front, she spotted a familiar face. Lena Patel, now in a more senior uniform, overseeing pre-boarding checks with a calm authority that hadn't changed, only deepened. Their eyes met. Lena offered a warm smile. Karoline returned it with a nod of mutual respect. Nothing more needed to be said. Outside the window, the plane taxied onto the runway, the sky beyond clear and endless. As the engines roared to life, Karoline opened her notebook and turned to a blank page. In tidy script, she wrote, "Change doesn't descend from power, it rises from principle." She paused, then added, "The sky was never the limit, only the beginning." She closed the notebook and exhaled softly, a rare moment of peace settling in her chest. She hadn't sought fame, revenge, or even vindication. She had simply refused to surrender her place, not just her seat on a plane, but her standing as a person. That quiet resistance had done more than correct a wrong. It had revealed the fragility of assumptions, the speed of consequence, and the strength of restraint. Somewhere in another city, Alyssa Crane was beginning a very different journey, one filled with accountability, introspection, and the long road back from error. Karoline hadn't followed up, hadn't gloated, hadn't even responded to the flurry of public defenses or criticisms that followed, because the story, in her mind, was never about punishment. It was about a cultural correction. One flight, one moment, one decision to remain composed when the world expects conflict. And through that silence, Karoline had reshaped the conversation, not by being louder, but by being still. As the plane lifted into the blue, she looked down at the receding city below, then leaned back into her seat. For Karoline Leavitt, the sky wasn't where the story ended, it was where her message took flight. The story of Karoline Leavitt's quiet but powerful confrontation aboard Flight 78 teaches us that real strength doesn't always roar, it often whispers. In a world quick to react, her decision to remain composed in the face of political bias and personal insult demonstrates that dignity is not weakness, and restraint is not surrender. Karoline didn't shout, post angrily, or create a spectacle. She watched, calculated, and acted with precision. The consequences that followed weren't fueled by outrage, they were driven by principle. This story reminds us that integrity travels further than influence, and that one well-placed act of grace can cause a cultural shift more powerful than a headline. It's a lesson in accountability, for individuals, for institutions, and for anyone who believes they can act without consequence. Karoline's actions show us that defending one's worth doesn't require volume, it requires vision. And in today's world, where judgment is often fast and loud, the true leaders are those who know how to sit still, speak clearly, and let the truth do the heavy lifting. The sky was never the limit, it was simply the beginning of where real change takes flight.